Federation to the World Wars. History of Australia 1901-1945. Federation of Australia. Military history of Australia during World War I and military history of Australia during World War I. The Big Picture, a painting by Tom Roberts, depicts the opening of the first Australian Parliament in 1901 on 1 January 1901. Federation of the Colonies was achieved after a decade of planning, constitutional conventions and referendums, resulting in the establishment of the Commonwealth of Australia as a nation and the entering into force of the Australian Constitution. After the 1907 Imperial Conference, Australia and several other self-governing British settler colonies were given the status of self-governing dominions within the British Empire. Australia was one of the founding members of the League of Nations in 1920 and subsequently of the United Nations in 1945. Britain's Statute of Westminster 1931 formally ended most of the constitutional links between Australia and the United Kingdom. Australia adopted it in 1942, but it was backdated to 1939 to confirm the validity of legislation passed by the Australian Parliament during World War I. The Federal Capital Territory, later renamed the Australian Capital Territory, was formed in 1911 as the location for the future federal capital of Canberra. Melbourne was the temporary seat of government from 1901 to 1927. While Canberra was being constructed, the Northern Territory was transferred from the control of the South Australian government to the Federal Parliament in 1911. Australia became the colonial ruler of the territory of Papua, which had initially been annexed by Queensland in 1883. In 1902, and of the territory of New Guinea, formerly German New Guinea, in 1920. The two were unified as the territory of Papua and New Guinea in 1949 and gained independence from Australia in 1975. The 1942 bombing of Darwin, the first of over 100 Japanese air raids on Australia during World War I. In 1914, Australia joined the Allies in fighting the First World War and took part in many of the major battles fought on the Western Front. Of about 416,000 who served, about 60,000 were killed and another 152,000 were wounded. Many Australians regard the defeat of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, ANZACs, at Gallipoli in 1915 as the nation's baptism of fire, its first major military action, with the anniversary of the landing at Anzac Cove, commemorated each year on Anzac Day. From 1939 to 1945, Australia joined the Allies in fighting the Second World War. Australia's armed forces fought in the Pacific, European and Mediterranean and Middle East theaters. The shock of Britain's defeat in Asia in 1942, followed soon after by the bombing of Darwin and other Japanese attacks on Australian soil, led to a widespread belief in Australia that a Japanese invasion was imminent, and a shift from the United Kingdom to the United States as Australia's principal ally and security partner. Since 1951, Australia has been a formal military ally of the United States under the ANZUS Treaty. Post-war and contemporary eras. History of Australia 1945 present. Post-war migrants from Europe arriving in Australia in 1954. In the decades following World War I, Australia enjoyed significant increases in living standards, leisure time and suburban development. Using the slogan, "Populate or Perish," the nation encouraged a large wave of immigration from across Europe, with such immigrants referred to as New Australians. A member of the Western Bloc during the Cold War, Australia participated in the Korean War and the Malayan Emergency during the 1950s and the Vietnam War from 1962 to 1972. During this time, tensions over communist influence in society led to unsuccessful attempts by the Menzies government to end the Communist Party of Australia and a bitter splitting of the Labour Party in 1955. As a result of a 1967 referendum, the federal government received a mandate to implement policies to benefit Aboriginal people, and all Indigenous Australians were included in the census. Traditional ownership of land, native title, was recognized in law for the first time when the High Court of Australia held in Mabo v Queensland No. 2 that the legal doctrine of terra nullius, land belonging to no one, did not apply to Australia at the time of European settlement. Following the final abolition of the White Australia policy in 1973, Australia's demography and culture transformed as a result of a large and ongoing wave of non-European immigration, mostly from Asia. The late 20th century also saw an increasing focus on foreign policy ties with other Pacific Rim nations. While the Australia Act 1986 severed the remaining vestigial constitutional ties between Australia and the United Kingdom, a 1999 referendum resulted in 55% of voters rejecting a proposal to abolish the monarchy of Australia and become a republic. Following the September 11 attacks on the United States, Australia joined the United States in fighting the Afghanistan War from 2001 to 2021 and the Iraq War from 2003 to 2009. The nation's trade relations also became increasingly oriented towards East Asia in the 21st century, with China becoming the nation's largest trading partner by a large margin. During the COVID-19 pandemic, which commenced in Australia in 2020, several of Australia's largest cities were locked down for extended periods of time, and free movement across state borders was restricted in an attempt to slow the spread of the SARS-CoV-2 virus.